Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, so it is February and a couple of months into the new year. I'm sure as most people have gathered, I record a bunch of episodes, sometimes all at once, sometimes depending on schedules, sometimes depending on releases. And I have a recent good problem. My good problem is I can't turn down a good conversation. And I have quite the folder and on the cloud somewhere of many conversations I have recorded. I recorded a bunch, just kind of worked out that way scheduling wise in November and early December. And I have yet to release them. And every time I have a conversation, I wish I could just release it, the next day or whatever, because they're usually just so good. And so I have a bunch kind of just waiting to be released. And, I've been kind of doing 2 a week for a while, actually. And apparently I've just, I don't, again, know how to turn down a good conversation. So I need to find a way to get these released. So for the next probably about 2 months, so the rest of February and March, I will be releasing 3 episodes a week. So you get to hear more of my voice, but really more importantly, more of the voices of all my wonderful guests. I really am honestly super proud and pleased with all the conversations I've had, and I'm really excited to share all of them. Just some really great people, great thinkers and researchers, and there's just so many good conversations about a whole variety of topics. And so I'm very excited about releasing them. So next couple of weeks, you'll see a lot more of me posting. I'm probably gonna try and hit a kind of Monday, Wednesday, Friday kind of deal. Might be a little changes here and there, but something along those lines. So I want everyone to listen to all of the conversations. I assume most people will listen to ones they like and ones they're less interested in, but I really would encourage folks to kind of give a chance to some of the people that you may not like. Some of the episodes are a little bit shorter. I think there's a handful of episodes in here that are maybe an hour or just over an hour or so. Hopefully a little bit more digestible than the long 3-hour plus ones I'm used to doing. Okay, so for today's episode, I am talking with Benjamin Herold. Ben is a journalist and author who's mostly written on urban education. He has a master's in urban education from Temple University, and his work has been heavily featured in many places such as PBS NewsHour, Huffington Post, NPR, and many other outlets. He is the author of the newest book, Disillusioned: 5 Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. Benjamin is such a wonderful person. He's so nice. I've actually, he was doing a kind of book tour for this, and I had a chance to go see him at one of the events in the area, and got to say hey and support him and listen to his talk. And he's just really, really good people all around. And he's really been doing this kind of work for a long time. And the way in which he wrote this book was just spectacular. We start off by talking about the 5 families and where they're at. So the book is kind of set up where it follows 5 families or 5 suburbs in different parts of the country. So it starts in the Dallas suburbs, talks about, I think it's an African-American family in the suburbs around Atlanta. I think it's a multi-ethnic family in Evanston, Illinois. I think it's a Black family out in Penn Hills, PA, where I think he's from as well. And there's I think a Hispanic family, if I remember correctly, from Compton. And so he kind of gives it follows a story, but in each of those places talks about kind of the unique features. So it's kind of the fast development in the Dallas suburbs in Texas, some of the multi-ethnic kind of heritage that Evanston has in Illinois, the multiple futures that are available in Penn Hills, and some of the long history in the founding families of Compton. So we talk about culture and history in each of these places. We talk about the centrality of schools in suburbs generally, and then in these communities. Talk about some of the cultural issues that have popped up over the past few years in regards to how it matriculates into suburbia. Impact of COVID-19 pandemic, the future of suburbia, and many more topics. This was a little bit different for me. I don't typically do these kind of pieces where it's kind of following kind of these case studies or case examples of sorts, and so it was a little different, a little bit challenging for me and how I thought about it and prepared about for the conversation. But I'm so happy I did, because again, Benjamin is just absolutely wonderful. He's he's a fantastic writer, and he's got just such a powerful way of telling stories and getting at the humanity of people all around the U.S. and really has a big passion for urban education. So, fantastic book. Highly recommend people pick it up. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So please, subscribe, follow. That really means a lot. I am slowly building all of my kind of followers on the Substack, and I'm really happy to see that. I'm very hopeful that these conversations are, at the very least, giving people different perspectives and hopefully educating in some areas from the guest. And so I'm very happy to see that. Obviously, you can contribute if you want. That always helps me make the podcast better. And you can, of course, follow me online. I'm less on there, but usually promoting the podcast. And so now I bring you Benjamin Herold. I am here with Benjamin Herold. Benjamin, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Great to be here, and likewise.
Yeah, so you've written a fabulous book. I really enjoyed it. It was. I almost felt like I wasn't reading. I guess it's not nonfiction. I guess it kind of is. I don't know. It's kind of like an in between. It was such a great way in which you told like the narrative stories here. The book is called Disillusioned: 5 Families in the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. And this is out through Penguin. It's really, really great. So we're going to talk all about this. But before we do, tell listeners just who you are professionally and what you currently do and write and think about.
Sure. So I write about schools, and I've really been exploring and researching and writing about and making media in public schools around the country for the last 15 years or so. I worked as a reporter at the WHYY here in Philadelphia, covering the school district of Philadelphia, and then worked for 7 years at Education Week, covering schools nationally. And so in the process of that, I got really invested in feeling like, you're a journalist. You want to kind of get into the heart of where the problems are, kind of that space between the country's promises and its realities. And I always kind of assumed like those stories would be out in cities or out in rural areas. And my whole kind of work was based on that until I started hearing what was happening in my hometown. And then that's what kind of prompts the launching point for the book.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. You kind of mentioned in the book, but this the book kind of deals with kind of suburbs, kind of loosely across the country, and with that, a lot of where the schools are at, and that's obviously a center point of many suburbs. But I guess, how did you come to write the book in this way? You kind of choose 5 families. You talk about, I think it's Penn Hills, which is, I think, in Pennsylvania, where you're from. How did you just kind of come into to writing it this way?
Yeah, I mean, it really started for me when, around 2015, 2016, when all of these really, really devastating headlines started coming out of my hometown, which is like an aging suburb right on the eastern edge of Pittsburgh called Penn Hills. And so like those all out of nowhere, like the school system had a $172 million debt. It was having to lay off teachers. It was cutting programs. Property taxes were going up. It was just a real kind of like vicious cycle happening. And so I wanted to understand why. And when I went back, it started thinking, what became evident pretty quickly in Penn Hills was that all of the opportunities that my family had already gotten there a generation earlier, where a white family moved in there in the mid-'70s, I spent my whole childhood there, got a great education in the public school system. All of that stuff that went into giving us those opportunities and resources, we had never really paid for it. It had like pushed the cost of that off. And the people who lived in Penn Hills now were the ones who were really paying the cost of that. And so that was like a kind of a troubling thing to understand. And I wanted to know if this was just happening in my hometown, if it was unique, or if it was something more broadly. So, through that, I, started to immerse myself in the sociology of suburbs and realized, there's this kind of typology of different suburban types and different stages of kind of the life cycle. And so from there, I kind of went into picking the communities to have this kind of representative sample that would show this kind of arc of development and exclusion, and then, kind of crossing paths, and then kind of the decimation of the tax base after.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I feel like for a lot of people still today, and it's just something that kind of feels kind of, in the book as well, as there's this idea of like an American dream, right? You're going to settle down, you're going to get a house, maybe a white picket fence, maybe not. It doesn't need to be that, but we don't need to be that stereotype. But, you settle down, you get a house, you maybe live, not in a city, but just outside a city. And, you drive a Subaru or whatever, suburban life. And there's this kind of picture of what that looks like, or what, has been told to you, or what your parents or grandparents said. And in the book, it's a pretty sobering realization of it's not quite like that. And in many ways, it becomes much more difficult. And of course, later on, we'll talk about some of the stuff in 2020 with some of the, racial conversations around the country, and some of the things after that. And then obviously the pandemic, and really kind of takes a turn in some ways, which is really fascinating. So, okay, there's 5 families. So you can kind of just give us the broad overview if you want. You have the Becker family in Lucas, Texas. You have the Robinson family in Gwinnett County, Georgia. The Adesina family in Evanston, Illinois. Smith family in Penn Hills, Pennsylvania. And Hernandez family in Compton, California. You can talk about it however you want, but it's interesting because they're in different parts of the country. And, you ever heard that saying that people say that, like, United States is really like 6 countries in one? It's kind of, sort of, I got that feel of like, yeah, you have different parts, the Midwest, the South, the Northeast, the West. And they're also different racial makeups. There's some mixed families in there. There's Black and Latin and white. And so you talk about how for choosing these families in these regions, was it like, I want to go to this region, and so let me pick a family to kind of represent that? Or was it the other way? Like, this family makes sense. Oh, okay. And it's in this region. How was the way in which you went about journalistically doing this?
Yeah, I tend to be kind of a big to small guy. So I was really thinking about what the communities first, which communities would both kind of demonstrate this kind of arc of development and decline and how it gets racialized, and then also have, kind of an interesting story in their own history and operations. And then from there, it was meeting the families through, just kind of knocking on doors and going to meetings and talking to people. So the Beckers, they're an affluent white family, conservative. Both worked, when they met, they were both working as bankruptcy consultants, and ended up on the Enron project together. And so that's where they kind of fell for each other, kind of doing the accounting there. And so they, they're white. They're mid 40s and early 50s when we meet them in the book. And they had lived in Plano, Texas, thinking that was where they were going to kind of get their version of the suburban dream. But they were not happy with the public schools. They didn't really like the neighborhood. The demographics were changing. And so they decided they wanted to move further out. And so I met them when they're moving into this affluent exclusive enclave in a town called Lucas, Texas, about 30 miles north of Dallas. They just bought their new house there. The Robinsons are an African-American family living in Gwinnett County, outside of Atlanta. Professional family, multiple advanced degrees, tremendous support network, thinking they're kind of moving into, a great community where they can kind of set it and forget it, and the highly regarded local schools will kind of do what they need to do. And everything's going kind of pretty good until their oldest son hits middle school. And then all of this kind of conflict over discipline starts happening. And that's when I met the Robinsons. In Evanston, Illinois, the featured family is Lauren Adesina. She's a multiracial woman who is a mom who grew up in Evanston, wanted to get out of the suburbs, went to Chicago for a while. But then after she had her child, she came back home because she wanted to raise him in kind of that safe environment that she remembered. And Evanston is a very progressive place. It's a college town. There's really it prides itself on its diversity and those kinds of things. So there's this kind of mythology of like it was a place that's working. But what we saw, started right around 2018 was things kind of going haywire, and a group of parent activists trying to respond to that. Bethany Smith is an African American mom who recently bought the house 3 doors down from my childhood home in Penn Hills. And so we got to know each other through that, and she actually contributed to the book. And then the Hernandez family in Compton, the parents were born in Mexico. They're now here without the documentation. And so, they kind of had this kind of push and pull tug of like, should we go back home? Should we stay here? That's kind of dragged out for quite some time, kind of almost feeling in limbo. But they have 2 children now who are U.S. citizens born on U.S. soil. And, their son is a gifted, curious, wonderful kid. And he's just started 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary in Compton when we meet him.
Yeah. So in all of these conversations, I guess is one of these things in how you detail the stories is, what is it that wanted to, I mean, books take a long time to kind of, write and things like that. But what was it that for you, I know you had said about the stuff with your hometown, but what was it about that as a jumping off point and then all these stories together now? Like you're not starting to write it now in 2024. You didn't start to write it in 2005. You kind of started, writing it when you did. I guess just briefly, what was the kind of now picture of it? Is like, if I don't write this now, whatever, or what was the kind of through line of saying this is an important story to tell at this point of where we're at? And, the book might come out in 2 or 3 years, but it feels very important now. Why the now piece?
There's this illustrative scene that actually in the book that actually comes out of my hometown in Penn Hills. And so they've had these revelations of this monstrous debt and all of this financial problems that have been kind of getting covered up for a long time. And the infrastructure is crumbling. And, there's just all of these kind of issues and challenges there. And the superintendent, when I interviewed her, everyone kind of thought things were going okay until they got this bad audit. And she's like, I started looking at this audit and there's some numbers that don't make sense. And the way she described it is like, I saw a spot on the ceiling and I tried to rub it off and the whole ceiling collapsed. And so I think that is happening in individual suburbs like my hometown, which felt like a compelling story. But once I started to realize that's part of a cycle where there's communities all over America who have already experienced that, who are going through that now, who are primed to go through it in the near future, but we don't have a kind of a common language or lens for looking at that. It felt like this was the time to try and do that because we have this unraveling really at hand.
Yeah, and so there's this interesting kind of a through line, right? Is that doesn't really, I mean, it matters and it doesn't, but there's this kind of example of you can be from different racial backgrounds, different socioeconomic class, you can be from different parts of the country, different histories, maybe different subcultures, but there's this line of people really care about what's going on in their communities and people really care about what's going on in their schools, both in terms of what education is being received and how people are being treated and things like that. I mean, was there anything that really kind of hit you in the head when you were doing this of like, wow, like all of these things, they're different people, different parts of the country, but this is the kind of connecting point. Like this is the nucleus. What was that kind of 1 or 2 things for you specifically?
I mean, the big picture, it was really this sense of families who had invested so many hopes and dreams. Some of them spoken, some of them just like the unspoken things we carry with us about how we see the future. What we would hope for our children. Providing for them in the way that we want. All of those things have become deeply associated with the suburbs. And different families from different backgrounds in different parts of the country, invest different variations of a theme based on that. We're all kind of putting this kind of very personal, emotional stuff into our relationship with the suburbs, and that relationship is fraying now. And that was the thing that was really common for me. I mean, for different reasons, and different families are having different experiences of it, but that kind of core connection that they had to their communities and all of the hopes they had for it being broken or frayed or severed, I think that is the through line through all of those communities and families.
Yeah. And there's a kind of almost like a barreling kind of very fast, towards some of the kind of bleakness of this as we get more present, which is I haven't spent too much time thinking about it actually after I read it, so maybe we can talk about some of that. But that's very it's not hopeful in some ways, and so I think that hopefully there's some hope there. But so in the beginning, you talk about Plano, Texas, and it's really interesting. I didn't know all of this stuff about there's all this like growth in Dallas, Fort Worth area. It's obviously a big area and things like that in the 40s, and there's all this kind of they start to need to build out, and so it's not really until you mentioned this there, until the 80s of where Plano, Texas was like basically developed. Like it's not a city that's been there for a long time. I mean, as it is today. I mean, and so there's like this massive like burst. And so when you talk about the Becker family, like they get there and then they eventually move on to Lucas, which is like 20 minutes away, 30 minutes away. Yeah, talk about how we see a lot of that. I mean, I can think of areas in where I live, where there's like, yeah, this is just farm country. And I can remember when there was like horses and cows there, and now it's like got a town center and everything, right? It's just like so, and 20 years, like it's just massive growth. I felt kind of like that here. So maybe talk just a little bit about that Dallas area and Plano and how the suburbs were kind of created and many people going and getting pushed in those places.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the area north of Dallas, like Collin County area, if you go back 200 years, it's just rolling blackland prairie. It's just tall grass and wildflowers and these kind of gently rolling hills, and it just goes on forever. And then you have these kind of small agricultural towns around there, and Plano being one of them, about just north of Dallas. And so, during that time, as an agricultural community, not particularly wealthy, very small town. But around World War II, when the U.S. government starts investing kind of defense plants and so forth in the areas around Sunbelt cities through the South, where you start to see his family starting to move there very quick to work in the factories, to work, building planes, tanks, electronics in Dallas' various cases. And so at the same time that that's happening, there's a lot of racial tension in Dallas proper, where you have, places that have been redlined, there's overcrowding, there's all this racial conflict with white people kind of bombing their black neighbors' homes when they try and move in. So all of this stuff has been going on for years. And that's when the kind of suburbanization starts to go north. So the highway is built heading north, and then these communities start developing almost like rings of a tree. Every 20, 25 years, you have another community develop one ring further out. And so Plano's in the second ring. And at the time we kind of meet it, it's right at kind of an inflection point of going from kind of a prototypical 70s, 80s kind of bedroom suburb kind of place to starting to turn into this more diverse, more socioeconomically diverse, more racially diverse, more dense, just kind of more varied part town with all of these kind of aging infrastructure that it needs to take care of. And so that's kind of setting the stage, and it's kind of now under pressure from new exurbs developing even further out than it did. And so that's kind of where we meet it and the Becker family there.
Yeah, you talk about in the 2000s up to 2010 at the very least, and I'm sure it's still expanding, that there was just this dramatic increase in people from different racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds. Is that just a product of because initially it was white folks, right? But now you see it there, and of course in many parts of the country where it is multi-ethnic families, it's Black and Asian, Hispanic. Is that just a kind of product, you think, of where the country is? Right, it's becoming more and more, dynamic, racially and ethnically. It's not really like by design necessarily, right? It's not even we're going to have a Latin community or a Black community. It's just more of, as the country continues to diversify, we're just going to see a lot more of that in suburbs, which can kind of give initially maybe some tension if, there's 3 or 4 Black families, let's say, and they're moving into an all-white suburb mostly, but give it 10 years and that's going to be dramatically shifted. Do we see that kind of thing going on around many suburbs in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think we do. And I think, Plano, in Collin County, north of Texas, becomes kind of this concentrated example because they have a really strong economy there, and in some ways a really kind of metropolitan economy. Large factory headquarters. Toyota opened up there, within the last 2 decades, and that just thousands and thousands of well-paying management technology jobs that drew people from all over the country. So but what you see there, there as you see in many other communities, like you mentioned, we are having this kind of, that's part of this larger demographic shift that we're really kind of like, nearing the crest of, where we see, the suburbs have gone from 79% white 3 decades ago to 55% white now. And that the trend is accelerating. Like inside suburban public schools, white kids are already the minority. And so, kind of see those dynamics happening. And, there's the conflict interpersonally and between groups that happens when, that comes together. But there's also this kind of conflict people have internally with, like, I thought this place was one thing. I thought my life here was one thing. And in fact, it's turning out to be another. And I have to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah, the bits in Texas were interesting. I thought of the film Tree of Life, where it's very much, I don't know if you've seen the film, but it's this Terry Malick film. It's a beautiful film. And it basically, it's kind of a non-linear film, but it talks about this, like, this white family in a suburban house or neighborhood in the 40s or 50s in Texas. And I think the dad is played by Brad Pitt. He works in like a plant, and it's a booming place. And then, you kind of fast forward and you see the son. I think it's in, kind of modern day, which is, I guess, would be the 2010s, where he works in a very, it's expanding and it's growing. I think it's another part of Texas. And it's very interesting to see neighborhoods and things change and shift over 40, 50 years and what that looks like, and whether it's by design or not by design. It's also interesting too, in the Texas piece, is my understanding is that many folks in Texas is, I know some folks in Texas. Texas is interesting because, I mean, they have their own kind of history and stuff, but it's very much, you're Texan first and then you're American. And it's always interesting to me when you see people from Mexico or from Latin American countries, or, obviously white folks or even black folks, or, when you have all these different types of groups, there's almost a kind of, maybe if you get like first or second generation into it, there's a kind of adopting that kind of mentality, right? Of like, we're Texan first, and then we're, maybe, American and things like that. Sort of kind of half serious, half, whatever. But it's interesting how there's a kind of, in terms of like, if there is an ever changing kind of suburban culture or even urban culture, but suburban culture, what does it mean about the very distinct historical kinds of like, cultural things that like Texans are, kind of their identity? What do you think about that kind of piece of it?
I mean, I think the way, for me, that showed up a lot, both in Texas and in some ways in a lot of the other communities I followed as well, is that there's this kind of tension that we're seeing now where the kind of, I guess, principle or mindset around which suburbia was much of post-war suburbia was developed was really around this kind of like individualistic, I'm going to do what's best, get as much the best position I can and put myself in, kind of constantly be in that race to do that. And so, what you saw is like that worked when there was policies of exclusion to kind of keep everyone else out. And when it was kind of a community was developed for like kind of all one group of people with the same stage in life, young families, all kind of at the more or less same stage, and, kind of works for that group at that point in time. But eventually the place changes. And what you start to see is like that mindset of like, it's just everyone in it for themselves. And how do we kind of set up a community like that? What you need is much more kind of cooperation, because you have people at different stages of life, from different backgrounds, from different economic stations. So you need some level of cooperation to kind of work through the conflicts over resources that happen. And suburbs are often just really ill-equipped for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, so we can move to Georgia. So in Gwinnett County, you kind of talk about this, there's a massive surge of African-American black families into the U.S. suburbs between 1960 and 1980. My assumption on that was that this was, I guess, a part of the civil rights kind of progress and things that we had in this mass suburbanization. Was that a big feature? And I guess in Georgia specifically, and definitely around Atlanta and different counties in Gwinnett County, you're talking about this kind of black advance and a white retreat there. Talk about this again. The South, this part of the South is very interesting. Obviously, different. There's obviously a history there. A dark history and so on. So, what's the kind of, I guess, makeup there of these kind of racial relations within in Georgia, and especially in Gwinnett County?
Yeah, it was, Metro Atlanta was another place where you kind of see this pattern of concentric rings of outward development. And so, initially, that suburban development was white, and it was largely fueled by white folks who were trying to get away from the integration of the city. Um, And so, the suburban communities in DeKalb County, for example, really kind of start to develop in that way. But around, in the 60s, fair housing movement within the civil rights movement becomes very active, culminating in 1968 with, successfully getting fair housing laws. There's, other civil rights advances throughout. The Supreme Court is, getting kind of much more engaged in school desegregation cases and saying, no, you can't keep dragging your feet forever here. We have to do this for real. So the suburbs are just kind of opening up politically and kind of socially. But there's also this economic thing that's happening where you have this growing Black middle class. A lot of kind of professional jobs that weren't open before are suddenly open to African Americans who are able to take that, and then they're kind of building a middle class life on that as well. And so what you see really kind of going, if you kind of go up northeast from Atlanta, through DeKalb up into Gwinnett and then beyond, you'll see this kind of like you described, kind of like just the a Black advance and then white retreat one went further out, and that happening, over the course, multiple times over the course of generations.
Yeah, and now we have, in the modern era, we have a massive, Black community in Atlanta. And it's not just Atlanta, the city. It's also, as you're talking about, these kind of rings outside of it. What do we make of, I guess, these kinds of, you can't ever plan certain things, right? You can't. People may try to, kind of do urban planning and things like that, but we have these kind of, in different parts of the country, these kind of clusters where people kind of coalesce together. And what do you think in this scenario? You talk about in the book, different types of class. Right now, you're going to see different types of class with different types of racial groups. So it's now there's a racial component there, but there's also a socioeconomic component as well. And so what do we make as we see the evolution of these things in certain areas, and particularly in Georgia?
Yeah, I think that's what I hope the book does, and what I really kind of guided me in how I was trying to write it was thinking about there's these sociological patterns that are happening. In this case, it's this kind of like aging suburbs, kind of that process of aging and raising taxes to provide declining services. Like all of that stuff kind of starts to happen. And this, as a result of these kind of economic and land use and structural forces we've put together. But there's also us as families and how we relate to that, how we try and make our own decisions and try and make the best lives that we can, and build the society we want within that. And so, in Atlanta, what you see is this, again, it's kind of bringing a lot of hopes and dreams out to those suburban communities, African-American families as they start to suburbanize, but not getting what they signed up for, because the place wasn't really designed for them. There's still a lot of racial hostility, sometimes racial violence. And then even when things kind of start to settle down, there's just this sense of we don't belong. Oftentimes it feels really pronounced in the public school system.
Yeah. I'll come to schools in a minute. There's that becomes a kind of a theme throughout. So in Evanston, Illinois, you talk about how there's a kind of multi-ethnic heritage that you kind of mentioned in the beginning, that there's this pride of having different people from different backgrounds there. There's a few places where I'm at in Maryland where there's also, I'm thinking of one place in particular where that's very much kind of the pride there, but it becomes interesting, right? Because you might I don't want to say solve one problem, but there's always something that kind of will kind of rock the boat of sorts. And so you don't paint the most rosy picture of it, right? There's maybe some good things, but there's also some difficult pieces here. And so, Illinois has a unique history. You talk about it being a free state, and then there's, at different points, black codes, things like that. What was the emphasis here? We can bring the schools thing into it now, on promoting good education in this area for a variety of ethnicities and specifically for Black folks. What was their kind of emphasis there on the education system? And tell us about this not so kind of rosy picture there.
I mean, there's kind of just to kind of paint a picture of Evanston, if you haven't been there or if listeners aren't familiar, it's this kind of like leafy college town just north of Chicago, right on the shores of Lake Michigan. It's very kind of picturesque with wide streets and tall old growth trees, and the sunlight comes in and it's just gorgeous. And so there's this kind of like Heavinston nickname. And part of that has been, that it's a racially diverse community and has been for a long time. It has a really rich history. Going back to the 1800s of a strong African-American presence and community, very much active in shaping the culture and life of the town going back well before World War II. And so, on one hand, you kind of look at this and say, okay, this is a place that's working. They desegregated their schools, their elementary and middle schools in 1968. They've maintained racial balance since then, which very few suburbs have done. There's a lot of explicit attention to issues of race and racial equity. So it's kind of like I initially went into Evanston thinking like, okay, here's a place that's kind of figuring this out. Maybe there's some lessons here for the other communities that are going to go through this soon. And there definitely were some lessons. I mean, it's really interesting what is happening there. But it was the path that kind of got followed was not what folks really expected. And so kind of each kind of new policy shift and new kind of point of emphasis from the school board as it became more progressive, more focused on racial equity, was kind of met with more challenges, more backlash, more concern, more inertia. And so, you see this real weariness emerging there.
Yeah, it's very interesting how there's, I don't know, that becomes almost their normal, right? And so when that's their normal, we're used to people from different backgrounds, things like that. You start to see other things arise and other things that become, kind of problematic in interesting ways. So tell us about Penn Hills. So this is your backyard in Pennsylvania. This is just east of Pittsburgh. Yeah,
that's right.
All right. I will give you a pass because you're my guest, but I'm assuming you're a Steelers fan, and over here we're big Ravens fans. So I apologize. I apologize in advance.
Well, you got me on both ends. I'm actually a Steelers and an Eagles fan. Being in Philadelphia, so.
Oh man, it's going to be a hard weekend in here in the playoffs here for you.
Yes, that is true. So Penn Hills.
Tell us about Penn Hills.
It really. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. It was post-war suburb that population exploded very quickly. I grew up there. My family moved there in 1976, right before I was born. And, our house was 1,001 square foot ranch house, with a little yard. And, my dad was kind of a do-it-yourself guy. And so he was like building planters and putting in playgrounds and kind of doing all of this stuff over the course of my childhood. But over time, my brothers and I went away to school. My mom and dad ended up divorcing. 30 years go by, and now he's in a place where he's long ago stopped his do-it-yourself projects. And in fact, a lot of the detritus of that effort has started to accumulate in a real kind of eyesore way in the backyard, which kind of is like this hillside that goes down to the parkway. So it's, you drive down below and you would look up and you would see these barrels he just had stacked and stacked and stacked. And so he leaves. But that mess that kind of accumulated over the course of my childhood and his life, it kind of gets left behind in our backyard. And for me, that kind of becomes a microcosm of like this relationship that I'm trying to figure out with this community that really gave me a lot, gave me all kinds of opportunities, provided a springboard to a comfortable middle class life. But there was a cost to that, and it's getting paid now. And so trying to recognize that and come to terms with that is kind of the emotional heart of the book.
You talk about this. There's this piece on this section about Penn Hills, which was interesting. You talk about that this region, and I'm sure there are other suburbs or areas in the country that have something similar, is being on the brink of multiple futures, which is a really nice way of putting it. What is it about the area or the history that makes it seem like it could go in this direction, it could go in this direction, it could go in this direction, but it's going whatever direction it is. But what do you mean by this kind of multiple futures kind of sentiment?
Well, in some ways, the community has a lot going for it. It's proximity to Pittsburgh. There's a highway right nearby. It's a large kind of stretch of land. And so there's always been this kind of sense of like, and there's really strong community in there of like, there's kind of neighborhood based on kind of the white ethnic group community. And there's been a strong Black community there since, way back in the first half of the 20th century. And so there's a lot kind of going for it in those ways. And there's a sense of like, if we kind of start planning ahead, if we do things right from the start, if we then have a plan in place to not only maintain and repair this stuff, but to do so regularly and proactively, not just responding to crises, like we can make this last. The boom might not be quite as great, but if we invest in the next generation of this, we can make it last. But like the place just never decides to do that. So there's this whole issue with its sewer systems that stretches on for 30 years because no one will actually deal with the problem that ends up culminating with my hometown becoming the first municipality in the country convicted of a federal environmental crime. And then a similar kind of thing happens when the enrollment of the public school system is changing dramatically and overall enrollment is declining. And the school board decides to build 2 new schools, but it turns into this kind of massive boondoggle that leaves the community with $172 million debt. And so, this kind of pattern of like, we could do things that might sustain what is in many ways a very wonderful and strong and close-knit community, but we just make the wrong choice again and again and again.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's right. I mean, Pittsburgh's up the road from me, so it's maybe about 3.5, 4 hours from me. But I live out in Western Maryland, and that story sounds very similar to many of the towns and suburbs that I see here. And I don't live that far from West Virginia, and here in Western Maryland and this part of that part of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and in Eastern Ohio is all this kind of Appalachia kind of towns where there's actually a lot of really wonderful, beautiful things about it naturally, and there's a lot of potential, but you see a lot of, I don't know, I don't want to say disappointment because that sounds like super negative. I mean, the people are nice, but it could be a lot more. It could be a lot more. And I do think you saw a little bit of that with Pittsburgh. I know, over past 20 years, they've done a lot of really building out and things like that, but I don't know how much that kind of leaks into the suburbs, and how much the impact of that is there. But I think there's certainly places where people do try, and they do try and do it certain ways. But
Penn Hills has been a place that has a strong history of kind of local activism, and where people care about the community. It's just that this kind of the mindset and principles upon which it's built are just really hard to work around unless you're going at it very intentionally and with a lot of resources and support. And so it becomes then part of the kind of population trend or wave we see, thinking about how that connects back to the city. It's almost like the wave hitting one end of the tub and then starting to ripple back. And so
that's nice.
What you see is, a lot of gentrification in Pittsburgh, particularly in East Liberty and kind of areas around University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon. And so Bethany Smith, who's the mom who now lives on my old street in Penn Hills, she grew up in a kind of historic Black neighborhood in downtown Pittsburgh. And over time, it had really gotten eroded. And then her family kind of got pushed out to the east end of Pittsburgh. And then from there, kind of out to the suburbs. And so, she's still very attached to where she goes up. But when she goes back to her old high school, for example, it's now condominiums that go for and apartments that, are for graduate students in the area.
Yeah. Gentrification is a huge issue, and I mean, I've seen it in DC and a little bit in Baltimore. Like, it's a tricky thing for sure. Absolutely, it's tricky. So go all the way on the other side of the country, and so you go to outside of Los Angeles. You go to Compton. I mean, of course, many people know about Compton, especially from the early '90s and stuff. But you gave a nice kind of summary in the beginning of this part of the book of LA has such a terribly fascinating history about the founding families there being from all over the place, mestizos, Spaniards, indigenous, Native Americans, Africans, African Indians, Filipinos, Mexicans, mixed individuals. There's so many people from its kind of origins and beginning. How does this kind of kaleidoscope of families and individuals and all these things connect with kind of the modern makeup of, Los Angeles maybe, but specifically Compton and that region?
Yeah, I think sometimes we kind of, as Americans, kind of lose track of the history that some cities and communities and regions that are, established core parts of the United States now, like Los Angeles, but they kind of, like their origin stories are not the same as the origin stories of Eastern Seaboard. And we kind of gloss over that, particularly those of us who are East Coasters. And I think, kind of understanding that it has this very different history. And part of that history with the original establishment of the Puebla that became Los Angeles, is this incredibly diverse group of people. And there were, it's a small kind of group kind of trying to survive, in a difficult place, difficult time. But they, there's no kind of real class or race hierarchy at first. And there's this kind of thing of like, there are these examples through our own history where like that kind of model comes up, and then you kind of see what happens. And so, obviously Los Angeles didn't develop along that principle. And you had, mass genocide of the indigenous populations in the years that followed. And, it was, the history developed as it did. But we see in Compton, this place that once was a prototypical all-white bedroom suburb of Los Angeles up until about 1950. And then demographics start changing. The tax base starts dwindling. There's tremendous white flight. It becomes the largest Black-run community west of the Mississippi. And then you have this kind of growing Hispanic and Latino population as well. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, Compton schools really, really struggled. But now they're kind of seem to be really coming out of that. And there's this kind of fragile rebirth that is happening there. And what was really moving to me about that, to see it and kind of be, kind of with it firsthand, is just how diverse the group of educators who are leading that is. So you have Black school board chair and Black superintendent, a Filipino principal, the teacher whose fourth grade classroom I followed is Chilean. So it's just this really, really kind of diverse group of people coming together to say, how do we kind of extend that old suburban contract to the kids who the suburbs used to try to keep out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very nice. Well, this is where the history becomes super important. And I totally agree with you on what you're saying. So I guess to kind of step back a minute, my question when I was reading this, and I guess I was kind of like middle of the book of sorts, I was like, okay, I kind of have like my teeth in all of these kind of regions and kind of with, the families and stuff and some of the kind of issues there. And I have this, I don't think any one of us are going to have the answer to this, but it's an interesting question that I think is worth considering is, how do you, when you have a place or region that has, it could be diverse racially or with class or what have you, or not, but when you have a place that has a unique history and they have a culture and they've built that over time, and then you have big change very fast, how do you handle that? Like, how is there not going to be some hiccups? There's going to be some speed bumps. There's going to be some conflict. People don't typically like change. They definitely don't like change that fast. I don't think that makes people, evil or terrible. But how do we have this kind of thing in different parts of the country where we can respect culture and history that people have built there before, and over time, slowly, you're able to say, yes, but we're evolving into, this decade or this century or whatever. And then it slowly starts to change. How do we do both of those things where we're like, yeah, we don't want to stay stuck in the past and it's just this way. We do want to progress for various reasons. But how do we also respect, culture and history that's been built there sometimes, for a long time? How do you, what's that kind of balancing act, do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
This question really kind of, I think, gets to the heart of the structural forces behind the argument that I'm describing in the book. Because, on the one hand, historically, the way we've responded to those kinds of dramatic demographic changes is by the families who can, particularly upperly mobile white families, move away. And you kind of move one ring further out. And so you've had this kind of cycle of advance and retreat. But in some ways, that's prevented all of this from coming to a head because you weren't stuck in place having to battle it out over values, resources, policies, personnel, budgets, all of those things. But now that's becoming a little bit less possible. For the housing market is tight. It's, water is an issue in much of the Southwest. There's all of these kind of forces that are making it harder and harder to do that. And at the same time, we have these dramatic demographic changes that are only going to accelerate. Suburbs are going to get more and more diverse very quickly. And so those structural things, those aren't going away. And so then the question kind of becomes, okay, how do we do, like you said, how do we deal with that differently? Because we're going to have to figure it out together in some way.
Yeah, and this is where I think that, this is something that the young generation teaches me all the time. I have a daughter that's in high school, and is, I think we make a a big deal about race and ethnicity, and I think based on our history, even more recently, that's a big deal. I think it is a big deal, and we do have to reckon with a lot of things. But what's going to happen over the it's happening very fast, and it's going to continue to happen 10, 25, 50 years. Is there's just everyone's going to be mixed, everyone racially. There's more and more of a lot of multiracial or multi-ethnic kinds of individuals. And it's not going to be so clearly black and white, this kind of, this or this or, whatever. And I wonder how much the saliency of race continues to push things if you just have a bunch of people that are all mixed. When we're not talking from 5 generations and someone that came here from whatever, my parents are, my mom's black, my dad's white, or my dad is Latin and my mom's from the Philippines. You know what I mean? Like it's going to be like that close. And what does that mean where you have generations of that? I wonder how much the saliency of, and it's not that race won't be important, and of course it is, but of more of how do we understand where people are in their communities? And just like what you're saying, how do you learn how to live together, even though you have different backgrounds or you have different kinds of social structures, things like that? How do we decide in this community or in this town or in this place? How do we kind of do that? How much do you see that as becoming more as we're 2024, right? In 25 years we'll be in 2050. Like, how do we see that over the next, 10, 20 years of where suburbs or communities go?
Well, I think that to your question about kind of like the changing complexion of America and kind of the diversity of kind of multiracial identity and so forth. I think in some ways that's at the heart of what we're seeing, this kind of tension and conflict, because not even just that, there's a different proportion of white people and people of color in the community, but because these kind of very notions of either or are kind of really kind of getting broken down. And for many people in America, that's a positive, wonderful development. And for a lot of people in suburbia in particular, it's a very troubling, concerning development. Like that kind of order is based on we're this, we're not that, we're here, we're not there. And so, that makes it really, really tough. I think is kind of a foundational place to kind of work around. Part of what was so fascinating to me about Evanston was that, you had this place where it was being very intentional about trying to work that out. And, talking about it like all the time, everywhere. And the struggle was still really, really pronounced.
Yeah. It's examples like that. They're like, okay, so what's missing, or what's really, we're not getting to the heart of some things. And again, each place is different. You can't, what you do in Missoula is not what you're going to do in Des Moines, right? Like there's difference here and different. And I think it has to be a kind of, there's some similarities, but you have to take a kind of individualist approach of saying, what does this town do, or what does this community do? And sure, you can borrow from other places, but I think it's important to see like how people here created things, and places have a different history. Out west is a little bit different than a suburb of Boston or something, right? It's a totally different history.
Yeah, and I think like part of what becomes tricky, but also becomes an opportunity, is that within all of that variation and difference, there's also like kind of this common theme. And it's part of where Compton becomes such a powerful example of, and kind of a beautiful place, what's happening there, because it's saying what the kind of core thread is, how do we take those central principles of what drove mass urbanization kind of in a good way, this kind of idea of investing massively in our children to shape the future. How do we take that, but put it into a kind of a larger worldview and kind of mindset that's about extending that to everyone, being much more inclusive about it.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. So you talk about, let's talk about schools, because I think this is something that comes up all throughout the book. And you talk about there's, all these stories of, there's the wonderful thing about the book is that you give so many good, narrative accounts and so many stories about all these things. And so you're talking about there's, lack of resources, financial ruin, racial challenges in the school systems. And as we see through time, people become, one of the things, like when people go to vote, like school board is one of the most important things, because that has like direct impact for people. And people really do, especially parents, especially people that are more at home or more involved in their kids' lives, they really become invested in this stuff. And, as they should, I think that's important. How does the what is this like the centrality for families in suburban homes that school district issues have? Why is that so important for people? I know it's like, yeah, people care about their kids and stuff, but like it really does become important. And you could take different political examples where like school issues become the central thing of like that political campaign and things like that. So why is this so important for people? Why do they get so ramped up about this? Around the country in different suburbs.
I think the Atlanta metro area, again, is a great example of this. And so in Gwinnett, when I kind of pick up the story, that's now a place that as recently as 1990 was 90% white. Now it's 2/3 non-white. And so you have this kind of really almost total kind of flip of the population, but the institutions are still controlled by that past generation of predominantly older, predominantly white local elected officials. And so that starts to become really an issue in the school board, which not until 2018 has never had a school board member of color, despite having 180,000 students, 2/3 of whom are non-white. Mm. And so in 2018, a young Black man who actually grew up in Gwinnett County named Everton Blair gets elected to the school board and kind of heralds this kind of change about to come. But I think part of what you see there with that is that, again, this whole institution is a $2.3 billion bureaucracy right now, the Gwinnett County Public Schools. It was built up around this kind of like one core vision of one core community that it was dedicated to serving. And, there's adaptations and changes with that, but it's still oriented in that way. And so the school board members who are trying to defend their seats, who are in their 70s, in some cases 80s, trying to defend these seats, are saying like, listen, this is the value, that the kind of approach to education, the way to run a bureaucracy that made this place what it is that you wanted to come here for in the first place. Why are we going to change it now? And it's a very deep thing of like, A, we think this is right, and B, we built it. And so there's, in some ways, I think what drives the conflict, though, is while there are those strong feelings, there's this kind of inability or unwillingness to see how a changing population might have different needs, values, priorities, gifts that it's bringing into the schools. And the system's inability to adjust to that and trying to hold on to the way things were become kind of this like background for conflict.
Yeah, this is where I wonder, there's so many good people working in schools, but there are so many at that level, but also at this level that you're talking about, there are a lot of systemic issues. I mean, you can't see it any other way, I don't think. I mean, and many times people that work there will say this, like, well, this is just a systems issue, or this is like a, whatever issue. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have a system or a hierarchy, but you absolutely should reform it and should try to make changes. But, I think when people see a need, a lot of the times people go to extremes of trying to like fix that need. And, because people are responding out of emotion, which I understand. So I wonder though, how much do we have, this is a big ask, right? How could schools proactively, do things to like change things, right? But, trying to proactively do anything is almost like it's like a wish list, right? It's like, that's never going to happen.
And I think part of what makes schools so fascinating as kind of a lens and a stage for a lot of these conflicts. So one, it happens in schools first. You have kids, tell us where our population is going. But so then also, it's just, they're such personal places. It's this intimate contact with total strangers, every day in ways that are like very influential, not just now, but for that young person's entire future. And like parents have invested money, their entire educational careers themselves, their own dreams and ambitions in this kind of place being a certain thing. And so, what became like interesting in a place like Evanston, where you saw like a lot of this kind of push and pull around this, was I think, the school board chair there, who I got to know a little bit, was an African-American woman who was, very kind of progressive, very pushing the system far left. And she said, towards the end of the book, one of the things that she kind of came away with was like, we need to give people who are losing something the space to mourn what they're losing. Mm-hmm. And she's like, I increasingly recognize the need for that, but what I won't do is let their feelings drive all of our policy decisions. And so like that was kind of, for me, that was like a powerful distinction, powerful way to think about this.
Yeah. I talked with somebody on the podcast about this idea of loss. And she had this book on politics of loss. It's interesting because she was like, we don't talk about it in democracy. We don't talk about it in a lot of things, but when there are losers when somebody has, in this context, an election or something like that. And I think in a broader space, it's like, yeah, when somebody gets something, there's somebody else that's not getting something, right? And you have to give people a space for that. I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think part of what I'm sorry if I may, but part of what becomes really challenged though is then, we have families from different backgrounds and histories and communities and circumstances who have similarly intense feelings about what they're losing. But when you look at them from another perspective, it can be like the thing that my family feels like it's losing, kind of seen next to the thing your family feels like it's losing. And my thing is kind of like, I don't want my children to wear masks. And someone else says, I just lost 3 family members. Bringing that together kind of becomes very tricky. So like the intensity is there, but the stakes are often kind of different.
I absolutely agree. And this is what makes it hard. I think people can conceptually agree with it, but when you get to, pick your issue, people feel, very, very, very animated in opposite directions. And so it's like, kind of to your point about schools being very personal, it's like, yeah, this is where my kid's spending, majority of their time for years, you think of an elementary school, people can be there 6-7 years every day, 6 to 8 hours a day. If there's aftercare, that's a whole amount of time. Like, it's not just, I understand when people say it's like, oh, we're just getting education and stuff. It's like, yeah, it's not just that. They're doing all these other things. They're creating social relationships. They're doing, there's all this learning that goes in. There's so much of like our development is in a school building, right? And I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think to your point is it does become very personal for people. And so in the case you're giving, yes, I don't want, my kid wearing a mask for, 6 hours, and then someone's like, yeah, I just, had 3 people that died. And it's just like, yeah, there's, especially again, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were, we didn't know anything, right? It was this moving target every like week. It was like, well, now it's this, now it's not this, now, now we have probably a little bit more understanding, but it's just, yeah, I think that becomes particularly instructive.
And I think, part of what I hope the book does too is like, with the, is kind of give a look beneath the surface of some of these kind of like, issues that become symptoms of something deeper. And so like, in Texas, for example, with the Becker family, the affluent white family who had moved out to the town of Lucas, so they had really moved there for this school district. But within a year, when the pandemic hits in particular, there's a sense of being very kind of dissatisfied with it. And like, so something's driving that. That's, have made this big decision to relocate that entire family to, to have this relationship with the school system. And then, a year, 18 months later, kind of severing that relationship, like that's a big deal. And so it's really important to understand, I think, what the kind of emotion and thought and principle is it's kind of driving folks to have such strong feelings in that way. And, I think, what I kind of part of what I came away with from the Becker story with was that it's about masks, yes, but there's like this larger sense of like our ability to be free, to do what we want, to make the choices that we want without having to kind of think about these other kind of considerations. That feels like that's the thing that feels like it's being lost, and it comes out in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing because I think that in each part of the country or certain communities or places, people are going to make that decision, right? And so I think people would kind of talk disparagingly about like, well, those people in the red states, they don't care and they're not wearing any masks, not following any rules. And certainly, I think early on during a global pandemic, that was probably not wise. I do think there is later on a space where it's like, well, that's what a real liberal pluralism is, right? I think there are exceptions to that, but I think that, yeah, people can move. They want to move to a place where they have more "quote unquote" freedom. That's the agreement. That can only change, I think, slowly over time. That's not going to always. It depends, but that's not always going to change, in a month because a bunch of people got, really loud at a school board meeting one night. And I think there are other places where that's not the case, right? There's, plenty of communities and suburbs where it was the opposite. So I think it's an interesting thing that people will make decisions based on that. I will totally agree with you. I didn't really realize this, but I know people that are married with no kids. And when they're deciding to buy a house, top 3 issues of buying a house isn't how many square feet and, what's, is there a new Starbucks in the communities? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's what's the school district?
Mm-hmm.
Like people, that's like top 3 of like people deciding where they buy a house
Right.
for ostensibly 30 plus years.
And
That's insane,
and
right? That's crazy.
That question, how is the school district, like it contains so many multitudes of like what our
Right.
values are, what we think is good and bad, what we, our disposition to the future is. Like that is a pregnant question right there with lots of things going on.
Yeah.
And so when that is kind of shifting under, shifting under your feet, like things are going to be messy. And when it's happening kind of on a wide scale, things are going to be messy. And so, part of what, you talk about kind of school board meetings, like that's part of why I end up really kind of arguing in the book that it's suburbia, and particularly public school systems in suburbia, that are now like really the front lines in these fights. Like we've been thinking about cities and segregation and the decimation of America's cities, and that's obviously still super important. In rural America, there's a lot going on there that we, miss at a national level that's happening there too. But really, I think that the core of the place where like these two different sets of values and histories and mindsets, and really more than two, but these kind of like competing senses of all of these things are kind of coming together and colliding. A couple generations ago, that would have been in like inner ring suburbs or those places. But now it's happening all over suburbia.
I totally agree with that. I think that suburbia now, even when I lived there a little bit when I was younger, is different now because I feel like there's a kind of colliding. So there's people that come from rural America or maybe lower middle class or even poor folks. And if they, as they, get older and they work their way up or they get a good job or whatever, they finish school and they're like, okay, I can move. I don't want to move to the city. It's too expensive. There's too many, I'm from a rural place. There's too many people. It's not my lifestyle. Okay. But suburbs is good enough. Fine. And then you have what you talked about in places like in Dallas or in Atlanta or things like that, where people are kind of either, kind of retreating or pushed out, or they're even by choice coming out. It's like, you know what, city life has been too long. I want a little bit quieter. Okay, I'm going to go to the suburbs. I feel like there's a kind of colliding of sorts in the suburbs of people that had city life for a long time, or they were raised there, or you have people that are from rural life, and they're just kind of colliding with different viewpoints and different worldviews in the suburbs. And that's why we're seeing this kind of like, as you say, these kind of front lines on a lot of these issues. Is that kind of track with what you're kind of saying as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that was just so powerful to me kind of in the process of reporting this was, again, I started in my hometown. Like, why is this place spiraling? Like, it just didn't make sense with what my expectations were of what that place should be. And then kind of saying, well, is it only happening here or is it happening other places too? And then that question, it was like, I felt like I scratched the ceiling and the whole, thing came tumbling down. It was like, wait, this is happening. Every community that I'm looking at or every metropolitan area that I'm looking at, there's some version of this same cycle and pattern that's kind of now playing out. And when you think about it, it actually makes sense because those communities all like they sprouted up very quickly, like in the grand scheme of things, 30, 35, 40 years to totally transform our housing market and land use. Like that's overnight. And so it makes sense that things we didn't expect, problems, issues, like those are all going to kind of come to a head very quickly because they were built very quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's an interesting thing to really kind of sit and think about. So I guess a few pieces here we touched on a little bit, but this chapter of the book is this liberals versus progressives, which is interesting. And as you're saying, and this kind of came, more recently, post 2015, post 2020, of all these culture war issues, which, I kind of I think they're important, but how they get talked about starts to get obnoxious to me. But how do we see like this really just took a life of its own, especially in the past couple of years of, race issues and gender issues and, certain types of class issues, things like that. I mean, well, how did this kind of get, exported out to the suburbs there? And you did see, I think we still see this kind of, I think you see it on both ends, but you have, the very extreme left or very, big kind of progressive folks, which there's some nice people that are progressive, of course, but, they have a lot of big ideas and things like that. And that's not always in agreement with kind of your like, moderate liberal that's like, yeah, maybe that's too far. And I think you have a version of that, an ugly version of that on the right as well. But how do we see in these issues of, culture war topics, where even people on the same kind of side of the spectrum are not always aligned with these types of things.
Right. And that's a great question. And I think, again, Evanston does become a great place to consider that because on the one hand, you have a place that, if you are to read some more right-wing media, like the Breitbart or kind of some of those places, like Evanston is kind of a common place that they come back to and say, look what the crazy progressives are doing. Look what the crazy liberals are doing. This is what will come to your town too if we support it. It's like an example or an exemplar of kind of left-wing politics gone amok. But when you actually spend time there, you realize kind of understands the oversimplification from afar. But within, you see there's some pretty profound kind of factions and fissures within them. And so for me, the moment that really crystallized it in the reporting, where again, this is all people who would be kind of left of center, but varying degrees of left. And those differences just within the left become very, poignant. And so I think it was 2017, this researcher comes to Evanston to give a talk. And he says, he's done this massive national study of achievement gaps and test scores based on income and racial gaps in the community. And so he basically tells Evanston, you have the biggest achievement gap in the country. And it's not because Black and brown kids are doing so poorly. It's because white kids here do better than kids anywhere else in the country. And so that becomes a Rorschach test. So, kind of what, I describe in the book as kind of the more liberal kind of community within Evanston sees okay, well, there's something that must be happening here before kids get to school. If these gaps are starting so early, there's, something they're not getting the reading instruction or the language opportunities or socialization at home. So we need to invest in early childhood. And that's an established and, kind of, there's quite a bit of empirical evidence in support of that. But what you see kind of on the progressive side, particularly younger progressives of color in Evanston, is they say, no, hold on. If you actually look at what happens once kids get in Evanston, even kids from the same economic background, but different races, those gaps still appear. And they don't ever get closed in the school system. And the school board chair who talked about mourning what was lost, she said something that, again, it really stuck with me. And she said, if we had this same conversation in this community and you said our girls are 4 grades ahead of our boys, the conversation in the community would not be, look how great, our boys are 4 years ahead of our girls. The conversation wouldn't be, look how great our boys are doing. It's how do we change this to get girls where they should be in the first place. But we're not having that same conversation around race.
Yeah, and it's on one hand, it's a nice thing because it's okay, you should be having those debates, right? Like debates about, education, about advancements, how do we want to do things? That's good. That's healthy debate. I think it becomes really charged when people get, really animated about, it's, my way or the highway, or they get really sensationalized and then, you throw some top spin on it with social media and things like that. That's where it kind of goes wrong. But I think that's something that I think that, this is why it's good to talk to people that, either aren't from the United States or just really aren't clued in, is when you try to explain to people this, that just don't understand it, it's wow, that's, I wouldn't get that from media or something like that. It's liberals and progressives are pretty different, just MAGA and rhinos are different, right? Right? It's just different. It's just there's some overlap with worldview, but not entirely. Not entirely, and not in I think a lot of times in practice, I think is where it breaks down the most. Where it's I'm kind of okay with this, but climate change is important to me, but I'm going to fly on planes though. Maybe I'm going to try and limit it, or I can try to do something I'm going to fly on planes, or I'm going to, still use straws, or whatever. It's one of those things where it's but I'm also going to, contribute here, or I'm going to buy a Prius, or, it's, and some people it's just no, you have to go all the way. Don't buy any clothes you have to make your own clothes. And it's just yes, you can care about things, but you don't have to care about things at an 11. Maybe I care about it at a 6 or 7. And and that's not good enough for people sometimes. It's just no, you got to agree with it at 11 or you don't care and you're a horrible person if you don't. It's just that's not going to be very helpful.
And, you said something earlier about kind of there being, kind of a lot of good people in schools. And I think, that is certainly true, and it applies to parents and families too. And so, what I part of what I walked away from this book with, and what kind of struck a chord so deep within me was the sense of these are all people who are bringing and families who are bringing a lot of gifts to the world. They're
Yeah,
kind, they have
absolutely.
resources, they have strong social networks, they have these deep faith foundations. They love their kids. They, see themselves as part of a larger community in some form or fashion. Like these are families that, like they bring a lot. And
Hmm.
so then the question becomes like, if the systems and the communities that we've built that kind of aren't able to receive and recognize that, then
Yeah.
that's the place where we have to kind of like really start thinking about, okay, how do we remodel and refashion things? But it's hard to do that, and kind of as you go. And so like Compton becomes such a powerful place for me in this, because on one hand, you see this kind of like return to this multiracial, multi-ethnic kind of collaboration around trying to invest in the kids who are in Compton now. But one of the reasons that's actually possible is because there are no white families in Compton Unified School District anymore. And so that
Mm.
kind of avenue of conflict gets removed, and it creates a whole lot of problems. But then over time, it kind of opens up some new possibilities as well.
Yeah. I agree. So two kind of final questions here. So you kind of end the book, as we were kind of alluding to earlier, of it's a little bleak. You know, like most people know, right? Trump presidency for a lot of people was divisive, and for a lot of people, they really kind of went one way with it, went another way with it, and people definitely have strong opinions about Trump and his administration. There's no like, it's kind of okay. People people are usually pretty strong about him one way or the other. And then you have on top of that the pandemic. I mean, which was complicated. Not only was it a health issue, but it was also a personal liberties issue. It was a vaccine issue. It was a economic issue. It became like all these things rolled into one. And I still think we get a C- on how we handle it as a country, but that's another thing to talk about one day. But how did all these things kind of, I mean, I know people personally, it kind of broke them.
Yeah.
Both kind of one of these things or both of these things at the same time, whichever way you want to slice it, it just kind of broke them. It was a lot. I think it was a lot for people collectively, I guess. How do we, and there was obviously the racial stuff that went on in summer 2020 and the kind of rebound of that. All these things, how did this kind of, you talk about in the book, really directly impact people in these kind of suburban neighborhoods and communities and things like that? This wasn't just something happening out there all of a sudden. Now it was like in my school, or it was in my neighborhood, or I can't do this, or I can't do that. How do you think we know how it played out kind of nationally, I guess, but how did it kind of, these things play out? A lot of anger, a lot of mistrust, a lot of all these things. How did it play out, I guess, in the suburbs?
I think part of what becomes just so interesting with this is like, we don't know how this is going to unfold. But if we
Yeah.
project ourselves into the future and kind of try and look back on this era, like I think there's a lot of reason to believe that we're going to, like, history will tell us that this is like, we're at the beginning of this kind of like, there was the civil rights era, there was the industrialization era. Like there's this kind of constellation of things that are radically transforming the underpinnings of our society right now. And we're going to, like 2016, 2020, were really kind of two, formative events in that. So I think, when I'm old and gray and I'm talking with my children about this, like, I feel like there's a good chance we'll be talking about 2020 in the same way my parents' generation talked about 1968. Like there's those parallels.
Yeah.
And so
I think so too.
part of what happened is stepping back and to be able to say, okay, if we're kind of at this moment in history, what does that mean for our lives? And again, we have these families, and putting myself in there too, of like, well-intentioned families who are basically good people who bring a lot to the world, who want the world to be a better place. And nothing that we do is going to, no individual choice is so right or so wrong that it's going to kind of fundamentally alter the course of this unraveling that's happening. Like, we're just going to have to figure out how to be in relationship with it and how to try and manage it. But that's not how Americans are used to thinking. We really we like to control the future and impose our vision on the world. And it's going to be interesting to see if we're able to adapt that and retrofit it to the circumstances we're in.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2024. I love politics, even if other people don't. And regardless, it is going to be a very interesting election year here in the United States of which older president we choose. So the last question I have for you is, in the book, earlier in the book, you talked about this kind of almost like this thing is in your hometown of this like Ponzi scheme of mass suburbanization, right? This illusion of wealth. Yes, you have wealth, you own a house, which is true. I mean, owning a house is the biggest, most common form of wealth in the United States for average Americans. But these new build outs, things like that. But then there becomes lack of repair. There becomes higher taxes. There comes all these issues with it that people aren't really kind of told up front. And in a lot of ways, if you're somebody that's from a different background, or you're from a person of color, and you don't come from money, you don't have a silver spoon in your mouth, and all these things, that can be kind of jarring of sorts. It's like, hey, I've seen those movies too, right? Like Suburbs, the white picket fence. You have a house, you do your whole thing. Kids go to school, kids ride their bikes in the neighborhood, whatever. That's not always what's happening. Instead, I'm getting all of these economic issues. There's all this nonsense at schools. This isn't how I'm more stressed now. Like it wasn't as stressful in some ways. And there's tension in some ways. And again, that's not to paint a picture that all suburbs are, high stress, but I mean, there is issues, and it goes to this whole point of the book, which is this whole idea of there seems to be a disillusionment of suburban living as we become more diverse. And I'm not going to say it's because of that, but maybe you say otherwise. So what does suburban life look like in the future, or how could it look like? How do we kind of peel away from this disillusionment and have a little bit more, of a potential good future that people could kind of, aspire to if that's what they want?
It's a great question. And I think, again, that, the disillusionment that is the core of the book and generated the title, I think it's important just to sit with that for a second. And certainly was the case for me. Again, I had been covering at the schools for 15 years. And I don't think I fully registered, the kind of like scale and scope and emotional significance of what was happening in the suburbs, but just how pervasive the stories were about, I thought I was getting one thing, and then they started trying to send my kid to the disciplinary school. I thought I was kind of moving back into a safe place, and then my kid is getting called slurs on the playground, or the teachers won't meet with me, or 27 other things that are these common recurring problems. And so that happening not just in one community, geographically or racially, economically, but in across communities and across populations, like kind of all at the same time. Like that is really, really profound. And so I think part of our work here, us being, media and journalists and folks who talk about it, us in my case being white people, I think part of it is sitting and actually listening to those stories and hearing their emotional significance and their political significance. And then, from there, I think, we are going to be forced to kind of like work these things out. And I think, this kind of conflict between worldviews and kind of values and priorities, like it's important to have a spaces where we can kind of talk about it at that level. Because if we're only kind of doing these proxy wars on like, CRT or, whatever it may be, it's just, it's not constructive for anybody. And so being able to kind of have spaces where we can have these stories and competing kind of lives and dreams kind of side by side to consider, like that's hopefully what I did a little bit with the book, is create a space where we can kind of consider them together, because I think we're going to have to find ways to do more of that.
Yeah, this is perfectly said. I fully agree with everything you said there. The book is Disillusioned, 5 Families in the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. It is out through Penguin. Everyone can go and pick it up and see you on a book tour in a city near you or wherever you're going to be at. Benjamin, this was such a wonderful, wonderful treat. Big delight having you on. I really, really enjoyed our conversation and really talking about something that doesn't get talked about as much, and what you're doing with the book and your reporting. So I'm very, very grateful for you coming on and talking about all these things.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the great conversation. Really enjoyed talking.
Absolutely.